So today, I am a storyteller, and I'm here to remind everybody about the foods that we had in the past, and how they helped our ancestors to fight back and to survive, where they came from, and so on. And at the end of this, I want people to be thinking about what are your traditional foods? What do you consider traditional foods? I mean, mom here might consider something traditional that I don't consider traditional. For instance, when mom was little, did you have macaroni pie?
Of course not.
No, she
We
didn't.
had macaroni.
Right, she
but
didn't have
not
macaroni pie, right?
We had cheese and macaroni, and we didn't have macaroni and cheese together.
So my traditional food is not her traditional food. So over here in Antigua and Barbuda, the first story I want to chat about is okra. Today, okra is a superfood. Yep, Mama asked, is that so? And it's being promoted as a food called an adaptogen to help people overcome stress and exhaustion, right? It seems to be able to reduce inflammation. And as you know, inflammation is implicated in so many things, everything from the diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's and so on, and even pain, when you have a swollen joint from an injury, and then chronic diseases like arthritis. Wow. It helps women who are pregnant, right? And there are other modern uses of okra being promoted there in the okra story. Okay, and one of the people in my group is growing okra at home. Says that's Zoe, and yeah. So I have a confession to make. I eat these things now like a snack, right? My children, my children are horrified when I eat okra as a snack. And I'm not surprised, because when I was little, that was the one and only food that I hated. She couldn't get me to eat any okras, right? I was sitting on the plate and all that slime just made me shiver and cringe and gag and think horrible things. So I'm glad that I got over that. I got over it when I was living in England and discovered that okra went very, very well with all those Indian foods that you can find on the British High Street. But okra goes way back to Africa. It's part of a technology that African people developed. Each of your islands, you have fungi, or cuckoo, or tern cornmeal, or polenta, and they were all made from corn. And Africans had foods like made from guinea corn, and millet, and all of those like in a ball of starch that the African would pick up with the fingers, roll it into a ball, and lob it down the throat. But what made it go down nice and smooth was the stew. And the stew often incorporated okra. African people discovered the plant many, many, many years ago, right? So far back in history that it takes linguists to figure out how far back. And they spread okra technology across West Africa and into Eastern Africa. Okra is not the only food that provided that smoothness, Africans had the baobab tree, the giant baobab tree, and the silk cotton tree. And little weeds also produce the sliminess. Way back in ancient Egypt, it was considered a royal privilege to eat one of those slimy weeds, right, called jute, which is now the national food of Egypt. And the Japanese people are investigating it, right, as an anti-cancer food. So it made its way across the Atlantic on slave ships and other ships as food for the Africans, but it was probably just dumped at wharfside when it arrived. And our ancestors saw it fit to find foods like okra and other African foods that were dumped and to start to grow them in provision grounds, you know? So despite the fact that most of the land was overtaken by plantations like sugar, right, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, the Africans in their little spaces allotted to them found ways to grow the foods that were valuable to them in the past. Some of the foods also served as medicines, like we were saying. And we have records where some of the medical doctors in the West Indies noticed that the Africans were washing their children, right, in the jelly-like water from plants like okra. So they said when the Negroes, when their children were scabby, wash them in this, and that their skin is healed and that their skin shone. Okay, so that's the story of okra. And want you to be thinking, what foods are traditional in my area? Where do they come from? And how did they help our ancestors? Okay, well, I think we have some people from St. Vincent in the group. Okay, so big up St. Vincent, howdy. Right. St. Vincent claims to be the home of breadfruit, but it didn't begin there, right? It began in the island of Tahiti, way across on the other side of the Atlantic, way across in the Pacific Islands, okay? Breadfruit was brought to the Caribbean because we were starving. Back in the days of enslavement, the United States decided to become independent of the UK. And during that war, our food supply was cut off. There was very little space in the Caribbean for growing food at the time. There was so much of the land on the plantation. Every inch that was available was being used to grow export crops. And the solution was to pull crops, food crops in from the United States. So colonies were formed. Barbados sent people over to the United States to form a colony from Barbados in South Carolina and send back food, right? Salt beef, salt fish, right? Beef, salt beef, and other foods, cornmeal and so on was being sent back to the Caribbean. When the Americans revolted, well, that was the end of our food supply. The United States was our enemy now. And so breadfruit was brought across from Tahiti. It's a very interesting story, which I suggest to read. Right? Get into this Padlet and click on St. Vincent for the breadfruit story, right? Click on Jamaica and St. Lucia for other stories as well. When the breadfruit arrived, the African people did not take to it, right? It was great in Tahiti. If you planted 10 breadfruit trees in your lifetime as a Tahitian man or woman, you had done your duty because breadfruit would provide food for the rest of your generation, your children and your grandchildren. But in the Caribbean, the Africans did not take to it. They realized that the breadfruit was going to undercut their rights to the cornmeal that they had. Okay? That the rights that they had struggled to get, rights to their meat. They saw it as a way that the enslaved masters, the slave owners, the slavers were a trick that they were using to take away the food rights that we already had achieved. And so they did not take to it. And breadfruit was definitely considered slave food. It was not until after the end of slavery, emancipation, that during those hard times, 100 years of hardship, right? Between the end of slavery, 1834, 1838, and 1938, that breadfruit found its own. Right? In Jamaica, it became considered as God food because it saved the people. And then, of course, Rastafari spread the use of breadfruit to the other islands. In Barbados, breadfruit is considered what you do in the summer. Children, young boys, for example, would find themselves down in the gully, right, cooking a fire, make a fire in the bush and roast some breadfruit, right? That was something to do in the holiday. And today, breadfruit is being marketed as a superfood. Yeah. Breadfruit, unlike flour, does not contain white flour, doesn't contain gluten. It's gluten-free. So it's considered to be a high fiber, gluten-free, excellent source of complex carbohydrates, right? So we're back from slave food to superfood, right? And it's time for Anthony Richards to shut up.